On February 9th, 2026, Donald Trump posted a threat on social media that stopped a lot of people cold. A nearly finished $6.4 billion bridge connecting Windsor, Ontario to Detroit, Michigan, fully funded by Canada, a decade in the making, might not be allowed to open. The claim was simple on the surface. Canada owned both sides of the bridge, the United States hadn't been compensated, and that needed to change before any ribbon got cut. But here's what made that moment so significant. Not the threat itself, but how quickly the documented reality pushed back against it. Because the Gordie Howe International Bridge wasn't built in secret. It wasn't sprung on Washington. Every ownership agreement, every funding arrangement, every permit, signed, published, and in several cases, approved by Trump's own administration. So tonight, we're going to pull back the curtain on this entire situation, what the bridge actually is, who actually owns it, why it matters so much to both economies, and what it tells us about the moment we're in, where physical infrastructure is increasingly being used as a chess piece in geopolitical trade disputes. Let's get into it. First, the basics. Because the scale of this project is easy to underestimate if you're only reading headlines. The Gordie Howe International Bridge is not just a bridge, it's a full cross-border trade corridor, spanning the Detroit River between Windsor, Ontario, and Detroit, Michigan, designed to handle approximately 8,000 commercial trucks every single day. The $6.4 billion price tag covers the full package, the bridge span itself, customs plazas on both sides, highway interchanges, and all the supporting infrastructure needed to connect Ontario's Highway 401 directly to Interstate 75. That last part is significant. Right now, trucks crossing between Windsor and Detroit have to navigate city streets, traffic lights, and urban congestion before they reach a highway. The new bridge eliminates that entirely. Freeway to freeway, border to border. A University of Windsor study estimated that change alone could cut commercial transit times by up to 20 minutes per trip. Multiply that across thousands of trucks moving daily, and the numbers become staggering. Projected savings for trucking companies and the industries they serve, including American manufacturers and agricultural exporters, run to approximately $2.3 billion over 30 years. This is purpose-built infrastructure, designed with a specific problem in mind and engineered to solve it at scale. Now here's where things get important, because the February 2026 social media post hinged on one central claim, that Canada owned both sides of the bridge and the United States was owed compensation. That claim doesn't hold up, and to understand why, you need to understand the deal that was actually struck. Canada financed the entire construction cost up front, the full $6.4 billion. No shared construction funding from the American side, but the arrangement negotiated with Michigan in 2012 under then-Governor Rick Snyder gave Michigan a 50% ownership stake in the bridge without contributing a single dollar to the build. Read that again. Michigan gets half the bridge, for free, up front. In exchange, Canada recoups its investment through toll revenues over time. Once that threshold is met, Michigan begins collecting half of the net toll income going forward, turning a zero-cost entry point into a permanent long-term revenue stream tied directly to cross-border trade. This wasn't a backroom deal. It was negotiated openly, documented publicly, and then formally approved in 2013 when the United States Department of State issued the required presidential permit authorizing construction. By 2017, both Trump and Prime Minister Trudeau had publicly described the project as a vital economic link between the two nations. And in December 2019, Trump signed legislation that included $15 million in U.S. customs funding specifically tied to this bridge. So when the February 2026 post appeared during Trump's second term, it wasn't raising a new concern. It was directly contradicting a decade of publicly documented decisions, including ones made during Trump's own first term. To fully understand why the Gordie Howe Bridge is so consequential, you need to understand what it's replacing, or more accurately, what it's finally providing competition for. For nearly a century, cross-border truck traffic between Detroit and Windsor has depended almost entirely on one crossing, the Ambassador Bridge. built in 1929. Privately owned since 1979 by the Moran family of Detroit, the Detroit-Windsor Tunnel, the other option, doesn't allow commercial trucks, which means virtually every 18-wheeler carrying auto parts, agricultural goods, and manufactured products has had no choice. The Ambassador Bridge, or nothing. That monopoly has generated more than $60 million annually in toll revenue for decades, and when plans for a publicly owned second crossing began gaining real traction, the resistance was immediate, aggressive, and expensive. Roughly $30 million was spent backing a Michigan ballot initiative that would have required statewide voter approval for any new international bridge. Voters rejected it by about 60%. Then came multiple federal lawsuits claiming exclusive rights to the Detroit-Windsor crossing, all of which ultimately failed, including an appeal the Supreme Court declined to hear. Even during Trump's first term, when advertisements ran urging him to block the project, the administration didn't act. Regulatory approvals continued. Funding support continued. The project moved forward, which is why the 2026 threat read less like a policy position rooted in the bridge's ownership structure, and more like a sudden reversal driven by something else entirely. That something else isn't hard to find, because the February 2026 post didn't appear in a vacuum. It landed on top of a stack of trade tensions that had been building for months. Ontario had banned the sale of American alcohol in provincial stores. Long-standing disputes over Canadian dairy protections were unresolved, and most significantly, Prime Minister Mark Carney had recently signed a trade agreement with China that reduced Chinese tariffs on Canadian canola from 85% to 15%, unlocking an estimated $7 billion in new export opportunities for Canada. Washington described that move as hostile, strategically disruptive, a signal that Canada was diversifying its economic relationships in ways that directly challenged American leverage. In that environment, a nearly finished $6.4 billion bridge becomes something more than infrastructure. It becomes a pressure point, a bargaining chip. If you can frame Canada as controlling a critical crossing into the United States, then threatening to block it starts to look like a negotiating tool in a much larger trade dispute. Except the framing doesn't survive contact with the facts. Canada doesn't control both sides. Michigan owns half. The U.S. secured long-term financial participation without upfront cost. American steel and American workers were directly involved in construction on the Michigan side. The economic benefits flow in both directions, and in several measurable ways, lean toward the United States. That's exactly why the reaction inside Michigan didn't break along party lines. It was unusually unified, because the math was too clear to dismiss. One of the most direct responses came from Rick Snyder himself, the Republican governor who negotiated the original 2012 agreement with Canada. Snyder went public. Point by point, he walked through what Michigan actually secured in that deal: economic benefits without financial risk, a 50% ownership stake without construction costs, and a long-term toll revenue share that would eventually generate significant returns for the state. His conclusion was unambiguous. Blocking the bridge wouldn't hurt Canada. It would primarily harm American workers, American businesses, and Michigan's auto industry. That last point deserves emphasis. The Detroit-Windsor corridor handles roughly a quarter of all merchandise trade between Canada and the United States. The North American auto supply chain, one of the most complex and time-sensitive logistics networks in the world, depends on components crossing that border multiple times before a single vehicle is completed. Any disruption doesn't stay local. It moves through the supply chain like a shockwave. Higher costs, disrupted production schedules, reduced competitiveness. The effects land on American manufacturers just as hard as Canadian ones. And for decades, that entire system has been one bridge failure, one blockade, one structural incident away from a complete halt. The Gordie Howe Bridge was specifically designed to fix that, not just by adding capacity, but by creating redundancy, something supply chains desperately need, but rarely have until a crisis forces the issue. When Carney responded, he didn't match the temperature of the original post. He made a direct call, laid out the facts of the agreement one by one, quietly dismantled an argument that looked explosive in public, but couldn't withstand scrutiny once the documented record came into view. When he spoke publicly on Parliament Hill, the message was consistent. The bridge is a model of cooperation. It strengthens both economies. It was built with materials and labor from both countries. It was financed in a way that minimized risk for the United States while maximizing long-term benefit for both sides. He also signaled a willingness to engage U.S. Ambassador Pete Hoekstra directly, keeping the door open rather than escalating. But the White House responded by doubling down, issuing a statement claiming it was unacceptable for Canada to fully own the bridge, a claim that, at that point, had already been publicly contradicted by Michigan officials, by Snyder's detailed explanation, and by the text of the original 2012 agreement. What emerged was a striking disconnect. The public narrative and the documented reality were moving in completely different directions simultaneously. That disconnect is worth sitting with, because it illustrates something broader about how infrastructure gets weaponized in geopolitical disputes. The Gordie Howe Bridge hadn't changed. Its ownership structure hadn't changed. Its economic purpose hadn't changed. The facts on the ground were identical to what they had been in 2017 when it was called a vital economic link, and in 2019 when American customs funding was signed into law to support it. What changed was the trade environment surrounding it. And once that environment shifted, once tensions over alcohol bans, dairy disputes, and the China canola deal began stacking up, a physical structure that had sailed through a decade of approvals suddenly became a liability to frame as leverage. That's the pattern worth recognizing here. It's not unique to this situation. Infrastructure, ports, pipelines, bridges, rail corridors, gets pulled into trade and political disputes regularly. Its scale makes it visible. Its economic importance makes it valuable as a threat. And its physical permanence makes it feel like something that can be stopped or controlled, even when the legal and contractual reality says otherwise. The problem is that using shared infrastructure as leverage tends to undermine the very systems both sides depend on. The Detroit-Windsor corridor doesn't serve Canada at the expense of the United States. It serves both economies simultaneously. Disrupting it doesn't strengthen a negotiating position. It damages a shared asset that took decades and billions of dollars to build. Here's where this leaves us. The Gordie Howe International Bridge didn't stop. The ownership structure didn't change. The economic case remained exactly what it had been from the start, a $6.4 billion investment to move goods more efficiently, reduce transit times by up to 20 minutes per crossing, save an estimated $2.3 billion over 30 years, and give Michigan a 50% stake in a major international crossing at no upfront cost. The facts were always there. In the 2012 agreement, in the 2013 presidential permit, in Trump's own 2017 statements and 2019 legislation. The moment the documented record entered the conversation, the argument collapsed under its own weight. But the bigger question this raises is one that goes well beyond this bridge, this border, or this particular trade dispute. When agreements are already signed, when the economic math clearly favors both sides, and when the infrastructure in question underpins a quarter of all merchandise trade between two of the world's largest trading partners, should political strategy still have the power to threaten projects at this scale? And if it does, what does that say about the stability of every major cross-border infrastructure deal that hasn't been built yet? Those are worth thinking about. Leave your perspective in the comments. And if this kind of deep dive analysis is what you're here for, subscribe. There's a lot more coming.